Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear us fine. Apologies for not being able to be with you in person, but I hope Zoom works just as well. Thanks also for that quite detailed introduction to us. We have been working in the museums and heritage sector, but more recently that has actually translated into outdoor and green spaces, really, particularly post-pandemic. So what we're going to do is to talk to you a little bit about the different types of approaches that we've been using to engage local communities with their local green spaces, and really to engage them a bit more meaningfully and in a long-term way than they may previously have been. We've been working a lot with communities in London, and part of our role is really listening to their needs and the reasons for visiting green spaces, and also for not visiting their green spaces. And we've been working with a number of organisations particularly in West London. And I think Neena's going to just kick off by telling you where we've been working and what types of programmes we've been running.
Thank you, Rinku. So, as you all know, I mean, the recent and ongoing experiences of the pandemic have undoubtedly increased people's interest to make the most of their local spaces, local green spaces. And some of our recent work has included, as Rinku said, has included working around with outdoor spaces in West London to encourage a wider range of users, and also primarily to develop sustainable community partnerships. Some of our work started just before the pandemic, some during it, and now we're looking at some post-pandemic engagement work as well. Each site which we worked on has been very different, serving different local communities, offering different experiences, and also with different facilities. And some of the venues we've listed here include Poston Banner House and Park. For most of you who don't know it, it's in Brentford, not far from where you are at the moment in Kew. It's managed by the London Borough of Hounslow. It's a Grade 1 listed Jacobean Manor House, and it's situated in a public park. And Rinku and I worked on the activity plans for both the house and the park prior to the pandemic to support bids to the Heritage Fund to reconnect the house and the outdoor space, the park. And we're now currently working on the evaluation of the house restoration and the activity plan, activity project. And undoubtedly, as you'd appreciate, this has greatly been impacted by the pandemic over the last couple of years. So we're reviewing what's been happening, what hasn't been able to happen as well. Osterley Park and House is managed by the National Trust. It's a Grade 1 listed Georgian manor house, and it's set in extensive grounds and parkland. And we contributed to the development of their community engagement plan over a course of a year. And unfortunately, the long-term plans, which we were about to embark on, were put on hold because COVID hit at that time, and funding, was squeezed. So that's sort of a work in progress, I think, that one. Chiswick House and Grounds, that's managed by Chiswick House Gardens Trust, with support from both English Heritage and the London Borough of Hounslow. The house is a Grade 1 listed 18th century house. It's set in landscape gardens and also has a very impressive kitchen garden. And with the backdrop of the pandemic, we worked on developing community engagement with a special focus on actually providing greater access to the kitchen garden. Gunnersbury Park and Museum, so all these places are very close to where you are, actually, is in Acton, and it's owned jointly by the boroughs of Hounslow and Ealing, and currently is being managed by an independent CIC. And the Grade 2 listed house serves as the local history museum of both boroughs of Hounslow and Ealing. And again, this is set in very huge 200-acre parkland. And we worked on their post-pandemic audience development plan, so really looking at what and how they could now engage with audiences that started to use the facility during the pandemic to continue that relationship and build from there. And our current work actually working in a green space is actually RHS Wisley. I know it's not in West London, it's just outside, very near Woking. And we're currently working with staff there to broaden participation from a wide range of their local community so that their audience begins to reflect the local demographics, especially around Woking. And we are focusing with them on developing sustainable partnerships. And we'll talk more about some of these in a second. So I'll hand back to Rinku.
So our first project really using green spaces was Boston Manor House and Park. And this was sort of 2018, so pre-pandemic, which is a lot of our conversation going to be pre and post-pandemic, I think. But what we did there was hold many community conversations in a variety of settings and with different target audiences. Our target audiences there, as well as park users and families with young children, we identified there was an elderly audience, residents around the park who weren't necessarily visiting, and there were particularly elderly residents who were at risk of isolation, who would really benefit from visiting their local park. So elderly community was one of our target audiences. Also, we realised that early years groups and families and nurseries, families with young children, weren't necessarily using the park at all. They may make one visit, but it wasn't regular. Well, that was another target group. And obviously local communities to the park. Hounslow, as is, most of you probably know, is nearly half the population is from a South Asian background. And many of those local groups weren't visiting the park, although it was literally on their doorstep. So what we did for Boston Manor is we did a number of outreach events. So going to local community venues, seeing what they did as part of their programme, how the park and also the house would benefit them, what their needs were, what could they do in the house, how would they use the park. And we also did some outreach with the youth parliament group. So we then invited them to come to the designers workshop where they were showing their plans for the park. And they were primarily interested in the sort of play area and what types of things they might like to see there, what they would do there. A big issue that came up time and again from families as well as young people was safety. They didn't feel the park was particularly safe for them. Families, they might spend a couple of hours in the afternoon, but they wouldn't let their older children go and visit the park on their own. So safety was a big issue for lots of people around the park. Signage, again, was quite a key factor that they told us about. That wasn't well signposted, it wasn't well lit, and many of the groups that could visit, particularly people with disabilities, were put off by the access to the park within the park itself. The paths weren't always even. Parking was a bit of an issue if you had a vehicle for disabled people. We had a lot of workshops actually in the house. The pictures you see there are workshops taking place in the house. Some were with young people, some were with local community groups, many of whom told us that they would like to use the house and the outdoors as a venue for some of their meetings, some of their own events. So using the space as part of their own program. So it wasn't necessarily programmed by by Boston Manor itself, but they would actually like to use the space for themselves, either as a cultural festival or just for their activity space, for instance, for embroidery workshops, for storytelling, for poetry, sort of creative workshops. So a whole variety of reasons that they might actually use the space themselves. So all of these ideas went towards an activity plan. And we did work with lots of partners to provide some of these activities. For instance, our parks, Park Run, Green Gym were one of the key partners. We also worked with Brentford Football Club on some of the sporting activities, and also quite small volunteer run partnerships. For instance, Edge Paddling was a volunteer run canoeing club, because there was the river which runs through the park. They were quite keen to be involved. And of course, major organisations like London Wildlife Trust. So a whole variety of partners that we partnered with who were quite happy to offer some of these activities and work in partnership with some of the communities to also curate some more activities which were in line with what the communities wanted and needed. And one of the key themes that came through into the activity plan was health and well-being. So using the parks for walks, keep fit, sporting activities. The other key theme was outdoor learning. So community gardening, possibly running forest schools, particularly for the early years audience, and also just things to do with nature. So simple things like bird watching, identifying some of the trees, the flowers, the plants in the park. And the other theme was arts and cultural activities. As I mentioned, some of the communities actually just wanted to use the space and the venue for their own particular activities. What we're also now doing, as Neena mentioned, is undertaking some evaluation to actually see the impact of some of these. We were hoping that the house would be open by now, but due to various reasons, not just the pandemic, it's actually due to now open, I think, later on this year. They still haven't quite handed over the building yet to the park, so we're still keeping an eye on that. I mean, one of the big challenges with that, I think, is a lot of the community groups that we spoke to have now either real issues around capacity, and some of them may not be as active as they were. There's been new groups, a whole host of new groups have been set up since we did the activity plan, as we're now still continue to work in that area. So I think the challenge there is to try and see which groups are still motivated and still want to take part. We know from our recent work that there are a number of groups who are really wanting to now embark on new initiatives that we're just sort of coming out of the current pandemic. So I think there's real opportunity there to revisit the activity plan and see what we can do going forwards. Next one.
The Osterley Park and House, as I said, this is managed by the National Trust, and this has, creates some sort of challenges. The park itself is actually located in the middle of a residential area. People locally know the park very well. They use it like their local park, but what they are unaware of, it's they have little knowledge of its historical landscape or the wider estate. And also, there is a pay barrier here, to park your car. It's pretty expensive. We'll talk a bit more about some of those specific challenges later. But, if you're not a member of the National Trust, the fee to go into the house or into the landscaped gardens is quite prohibitive. So people are aware of the free access space, and it is very well used for picnics, for sporting activities, for people just gathering for walks. But beyond that, people don't really understand the space. And our challenge there was really to try and connect these things up and actually broaden people's understanding of the wider estate. And what we did here is that we worked with a range of community organisations, encouraging first-time visits for a lot of them in terms of the areas they may not have visited before. And we did these with guided visits with specialists, working on the site, and actually did bespoke activities to develop an ongoing community programme with them, and then to explore long-term partnerships. So, for example, if you look at the photos there, we invited, the top photograph there is where we invited some primary school teachers from local schools to explore opportunities to use the site for a range of orienteering activities for pupils. And this has continued and is beginning to be used a lot for that. We also invited CHI, which is a local organisation. CHI stands for Culture, History and I, and they're a voluntary group who are specifically interested in exploring their cultural heritage around plants and looking at plant-based remedies and growing food. And they took part in the behind-the-scenes garden tours and came up with ideas for activities and projects with the gardening team there. We also worked with the youth wing of the Sikh Awareness Trust, and they explored the site and they engaged in a series of environmental art activities. So looking at, picking and bringing art and materials into a workshop activity and then actually creating something which they actually then left in situ for other people to enjoy. And working with other organisations, a whole host of other activities were also identified in terms of the usage of the space. Art and music classes, using outdoors for that, Tai Chi and yoga, and stroll and a cuppa, which was really walks across the site, accompanied walks, followed by tea and conversations. And these were really popular with vulnerable groups and individuals, and work, very much to provide a sort of social setting of coming together of people to just chat, but also to appreciate their local landscape. And as I mentioned with this, I think the team there do want to continue a lot of this work and are picking up from where we sort of left off just pre-pandemic.
We also wanted to talk a little bit about one of the initiatives that we did at Osterley called Fun Palaces. Some of you may have heard of it already, but it's actually a sort of national organisation, and it supports local people to co-create their own sort of cultural environmental activities at community venues. And they will provide the marketing, they will provide support. And the whole idea is to get volunteers to run the event, but also the local community involved with actually facilitating the events for their own local community. So we asked a number of creative practitioners around Osterley to put on some workshops. So these were canvas painting, you can see on the top there, some environmental art workshops, and some music, which was tabla playing in this instance. So it was run, I think, one weekend in October, and we did a bit of publicity by offering free car parking and free entrance to the house and gardens if you brought a flyer along. And this was to make sure that families who visited, who hadn't previously visited, and we did get over 15% first-time visitors to Osterley by offering this flyer. Many had actually been unaware of the park, that they were able to visit. They were unaware that the park was actually free to access throughout the year, but they were also told us that they did find it quite an intimidating space. It's surrounded by high brick walls and gates. So they did find the park itself a bit intimidating to visit. Many families came, about 80 families took part in each workshop, and what Nina and I did was had a number of interviews with lots of the families, asking them particular questions about what would make the visit more engaging, what would make them come regularly. And many of them did say that although it was a very lovely space, they may not necessarily visit regularly, because there wasn't an offer there for families, a regular program of events or activities taking place, because it would mean a special trip for them to come. So unless there was something to do for their children, they may not necessarily come. So that was some feedback that we took back to Osterley, and they are revisiting the program that they offer for families. As many were put off by the price of the car parking, which was a flat fee of £7. So if you wanted to go just for an hour or two, you were still paying that same price. So there was quite a pay barrier there for families to access the park. And many of them didn't know about the gardens, because again, it was a pay barrier there. And the gardens itself were quite out of bounds for lots of them. So when we did open these up, it was a real eye-opener for some of them, that they didn't know such lovely gardens existed virtually on their doorstep. So, once you open these spaces up, people are very happy to come along, and lots of them said in future they would come, particularly if there were activities for children taking place.
Moving on to Chiswick House and Gardens, and as we mentioned earlier, this project we're working with Chiswick was post-pandemic. And what we did here, our approach here, the first thing we did was actually hold an open day for community leaders who represented a wide range of local community organisations. You can see we've listed them here. Darpan, for example, is a local sort of intergenerational organisation working with Bengali families and looking at culture and arts. Heston West Big Local, they work in the Heston end of the borough of Hounslow and provide activities and projects and run projects for the local community there, especially vulnerable families, so focus on those. The Multicultural Centre, some of you may know about, Hounslow Seniors Trust, who have an annual festival every year, and that's been going for over 25 years. And Tringen, then, just reading the ones that maybe don't, may not understand what they are straight away. Tringen is a local women's organisation who work in the different venues across the borough, promoting culture and arts, especially focusing on older Asian women. So here we did hold this open day for community leaders, and this enabled the sort of representatives to experience the site prior to bringing their members actually along for a visit or an activity. They could meet with staff and volunteers, discuss ideas through bespoke activities that may reflect the needs and interests of their members, and then also highlight any challenges and discuss those beforehand as well. Many of them, in fact, hadn't visited the site before, which, and they're running these sort of quite large, or some organisations have been running quite a long time in the borough. But, the thing with Chiswick, it's completely the east end of the borough of Hounslow, and there aren't fantastic, local transport connections between one end of the borough or the other. So it becomes quite difficult for people to access that venue. But it also enabled people, these communities, to actually network with each other, which was really something we hadn't really thought about beforehand. And they discussed opportunities of developing our projects together on site and also back in their own communities, and that we know has continued. So that was just another way of, like, before we actually did any specific activities or actually brought groups in, that was just another way of actually working with community leaders from the start of actually doing anything.
So one of the key partners we worked with actually at Chiswick were children's centres, and they support families primarily with who have children under 5 years old. We actually invited them for a day at Chiswick to see what they wanted to do. So they actually have a team of early years practitioners, so who were able to facilitate a lot of the activities. For instance, you've got them doing some storytelling. We were blessed with a very, very warm day, luckily. So they will be able to use the kitchen gardens, which was quite a closed, safe space for the families. So they did some storytelling that you can see there. We worked in partnership with other providers like Cultivate London, provided some hands-on practical gardening activities. And a big advantage of working with partners such as children's centres is they have a really good link with lots of families in the borough who may not necessarily have the confidence to visit outdoor spaces by themselves, and they know there will be some facilitated visits that they can go to. The children's centres run a whole programme of regular events and visits, and so Chiswick can become like one of their regular events that they put on, a visit to Chiswick House. The other big advantage of children's centres is they collect all sorts of data. So for Chiswick, they knew where the children had come from, they knew what ethnicity, they knew about their health and well-being, and they can actually target specific families who they know need help maybe getting to these places, or need help in actually just orienteering themselves to these unfamiliar spaces. And the team also are very keen on developing resources. So they will develop packs and materials particularly for family groups, because they are teams of early year practitioners, so they know what works, what doesn't work. And they're one of the key partners that we've worked with quite closely, particularly in Hounslow, with a lot of the green spaces that we've done some work with. And they're also great at promoting any events, as you can see from their Twitter feed. And they have newsletters, so they'll promote it to all the families that they work with in the areas.
little bit more about some of the local providers that we worked with in Chiswick. We felt it was really important to build relationships and support local providers who could lead any specialist sort of pilot sessions or activities. And some of these now are actually continuing, and they are part of an ongoing programme, and there is a community development officer in post at Chiswick as a result of these pilot activities. And, you know, just to go through some of these here, Cultivate London, they're based in Isleworth. They run a community garden and they focus on improving health and well-being with outdoor-based learning for family groups, schools and community groups. And they're run by professional horticulturalists and educators. So they actually ran a pilot schools programme, and they worked with a variety of different community groups to run arts and crafts activities, but as well as some planting activities. Let's Go Outside and Learn. They specialise in connecting the local community with nature through outdoor activities and specialising in walks as well. And they focus particularly on vulnerable groups. And they also keep the information and the data on the groups they're working with, and they actually chart the progress of individuals and get them to start to self-lead projects as well. So they do a lot of work in outdoor spaces, green spaces across West London. Hammersmith Community Gardens, they're a group of horticulturalists specialising in outreach activities, very active, and they work with schools and communities across London now, and they offer bespoke creative and gardening activities. And they've run some of these sessions that you can see here. Manju Malhi, she's an author, locally based, and a chef. And she specialises in healthy eating, and she offers workshops, cookery workshops for intergenerational groups. And she introduced the groups to the herbs and other foods and plants growing in the kitchen garden. And participants, they were encouraged to pick those plants and then include them in outdoor cooking sessions. And, you know, for some young people, it's the first time that they were actually seeing these herbs or plants being grown, and then actually taking part and actually picking them and then using them in whatever the recipes that they were working with Manju. And it was great for families to do that together as a group, because we think this did, from feedback we've had, has continued, you know, beyond the activities, but back in the home as well. And Manju runs these activities with different community organisations across London, just connecting the outdoor plants and herbs with actual practical cookery sessions. Rinku will tell us a bit about the other two groups, I think.
Yeah, so we've also currently doing an evaluation for Chiswick, so we've just spoken to some of these providers, seeing how the activities have been going. So Mind Food, who run a whole wellbeing programme, a 6-week course around different activities. One of them you can see on the top there was quite a creative artistic session that they ran, but it's also about looking quite closely and observing nature quite closely. So they did that with a women's group. Since I've spoken to them just a few weeks ago, actually, they are now running a course for the Deaf Women of Ealing group. And their suggestion actually is what they'd like to do, which does take time, which they haven't managed to do at Chiswick yet, is really take over some of the kitchen garden for the community, which was an idea which came up in the pilot phase when we were working on it. But because these things take time, and they have a new garden team just starting there now. So what they would like to do is now collaborate and work much closely with the garden team on planning that whole community garden and how that could take shape with some of the community partners who are already on board. This is like the first year of the community programme, really. So it's to take that much further and really plan things together with the garden team. A Wild Mind Project run a mental health wellbeing course for young people in particular. They've done one course there, but they've said to us they've been finding it a real challenge to really recruit people to this to their project, particularly in Hounslow, because mental health is still really not discussed, particularly within South Asian families. So they're going to broaden their scope to I think the whole of West London and not just Hounslow and Ealing, because they're finding that most of the attendees to their course are actually, middle class white students who are on their way to university. So which is not quite their target audience, but they're finding it a real challenge. So but we'll see how they progress with the courses there at Chiswick. So, on to Gunnersbury Park Museum. We were asked here to provide a community engagement plan to tie in with their own audience development plan, which was currently just starting at Gunnersbury. As with Chiswick, we held a number of community open days, and we were lucky here because Gunnersbury already has a community engagement officer in place. But what they wanted us to do is really broaden their scope with communities, because they really are aiming to co-curate the interpretation both within the museum and for their outdoor exhibition spaces. So they really wanted to work with us to identify some key community partners who would work with them in the long term. So what we did do is invite these community groups to have a tour within the museum, but also walk around the park. And many of them told us that although they'd visited the park quite regularly, mainly for picnics and walks, some of them hadn't explored the wider area of the park. So within the sort of just a more wild nature aspect of the park, they hadn't really explored there. So they would be quite happy to pilot some accessible tours around the park. They were quite keen to again explore some cookery there. You've got a picture there, I think the chef Monju, who Nina mentioned, who piloted a cookery session using the Victorian kitchens as a venue. That might be a regular thing, maybe using some of the plants and herbs from the community gardens there. So we evaluated some of the activities that took place and also identified some partners for the interpretation, but also some partners told us they were quite keen for staff to come out to them, particularly to record some of the oral histories, particularly for older residents who couldn't always get to the park, but who had real significant stories to tell about their time growing up around Gunnersbury area.
Moving on to RHS Wisley. We're currently working with staff. This is a current project happening at the moment, to co-produce some interpretation for the World Food Garden with local community groups. So following sort of tours of the World Food Garden, groups and gardening staff worked together and they shared stories, personal stories and knowledge relating to growing food, recipes and remedies. So there's very much quite a lot of involvement from the gardening staff. They really listened to the community groups, were engaged with their stories and shared their own skills and knowledge about plants, and they both sort of learnt from each other. And what they've decided to do now is to take this to the next stage and to record some of this, these conversations and these stories and use them as interpretation in the garden. So there's going to be recording sessions, they're going to check some photographs, and people's stories will be there for other people to enjoy. And what the groups also identified in those sessions that we were having with them, that they would also like to benefit from some practical gardening sessions and gardening workshops. And that would be including growing plants in containers, gardening to encourage wildlife, looking at no-dig gardening, composting and propagation. So these are now planned to be held with the intention of developing some long-term partnerships with some community organisations. And again, here what RHS Wisley were able to do was to give out some passes to the organisations who took part in these activities, so they could come back and visit with their wider group and with their friends and family as well. And we know, spoken to a couple of them recently, and they have actually bought some membership as well for the RHS membership. So I think, it's like once in and they understand what the potential of the space is and what they could, and they feel more comfortable about using certain spaces, they are happy to sort of engage in a sort of mainstream way as well, actually, as paying visitors and encouraging their families and friends to do that, as well as doing sort of community activities.
just thought we'd share an example of some of the stories that they came up with on their first visits. I think a lot of the plants stimulated memories of growing up back home, from the chickpeas to pomegranate to sugar cane, which one of the group, many from Kenyan Asian women who came, who were talking about the sugar cane. And that, of course, lends itself to further discussion around the sugar trade, the historic trade in sugar, and also, to contemporary issues around sugar and healthy diets and the sugar tax. An awful lot of discussion, and these were just, the first workshops that were held. We also had a group of Syrian families who came. And that led to some quite interesting discussion around the role of gardens like Wisley, and the role of public gardens that in Syria, which is quite different. So there's some interesting comparisons around, the role of gardening, the role of land, and the ability to grow your own food. I think that was quite interesting. There's a lot of families who have traditional farming. So looking, the way they grow their crops as well. So some very interesting discussion, and it's great that Wisley are now taking on board some of their interpretation plans. Okay, we thought we'd just come to talk to you about some of the common challenges that we faced. A lot of it is about lack of awareness, but also there's sort of a little recognition of some of the possible partners, both from the community side, but also from the organisational side, that there can be quite long-term partnerships with community organisations. Access, again, comes up as a barrier, particularly public transport. This was quite key to, I think, Chiswick, that trying to find Chiswick on public transport was a real challenge. And then again, once you're at Chiswick, finding the kitchen garden was another challenge in itself. Pay barrier we mentioned before, the car parking. Sites can seem, particularly historic sites, can sometimes seem intimidating and quite unwelcoming places, big gates, etc., brick walls. And many communities are nowadays quite wary of just coming for a visit or just being consulted with, and they really want to be involved in some long-term sustainable programs where their needs are met. There has been some resistance to change, particularly in working with diverse groups by some staff and also volunteers that we've come across. But I think the leadership has been quite open to change that we found, particularly working with these organisations. It's always this particular staff, particular volunteers who are still finding their feet on the, changing the way they work, really. And funding, which was always a challenge, but we've also put it down as an opportunity as well.
Yeah, I'm leading on from there. Some of the opportunities, just to again summarise, the partnerships, opportunity to diversify a regular audience and also visitors, the knowledge and skills exchange, and this requires an openness by horticultural staff in order for it to actually be successful, as we pointed out with RHS Wisley, and it can actually lead to long-term engagement. Community access schemes, that some places have them, some places don't, and they're all very different in different places if they do exist. But what it does enable groups to do is to enable them to bring groups back and incorporate their own sort of regular core activities that they may be doing with their own organisations, and using the open space, the green space, as part of their own activity programme, so it becomes a regular place of visit for them. And opportunities for volunteering, again, people are interested in exploring opportunities, and also a lot of the venues that we've been working with want to engage a wider range of people as volunteers. But what we found is, and we think, what we've come to the conclusion that we feel in some cases the existing sort of models that exist for volunteering actually do need to change. People don't want to be become a volunteer and be just an extra pair of free hands, if it were, to undertake some core work that might need to be done across the site. they would like to do that, but also to feel, you know, that they could benefit creatively, they could actually benefit from some skills. And maybe we look at making opportunities for volunteers a bit more flexible, look at holiday-based activities that would attract younger people and students, and short-term volunteering opportunities with a purpose that may lead to some sort of installation, an exhibition, or around a festive theme of celebrating some sort of festivity. So again, I think there is a lot of interest. People have got time, they want to learn new skills, they want to contribute to their local community, but they want it to be a two-way thing, and that to be a bit more implicit in the offer. And as we mentioned earlier, using the spaces for community access and community activities and green spaces, not just traditional gardening type activities, what people are saying. They want to use the green spaces to be venues for art, music, yoga, festivals. So just to sort of see the venue beyond, you know, as an actual venue for community engagement. And outreach in the community, this has come up on many occasions because, you know, especially as a result of the pandemic, many organisations, they're planning to establish their own local community gardens, and they could really benefit from some expertise from professionals, and that would actually engage them with green spaces and with professionals in a really meaningful way. So it means people going out into the community, sharing their skills on site, and then making links back to the venue as well. So there's flexibility around that would need to happen to allow staff to be able to be freed up to incorporate some outreach work in the community. But again, that could lead, we feel, you know, and it has begin to these sort of long-term partnerships and meaningful partnerships. And positive engagement, it can also lead to sort of environmental stewardship, as we've listed here, or sort of a sense of ownership, and people begin to develop a much more pride in their local green spaces. And, you know, with this sort of engagement, it just raises awareness about a whole sort of area, its history, what's growing there, its landscape, you know, with the wider community through word of mouth. So if we're engaging with specific community organisations, that word of mouth, you know, naturally it gets out very quickly, and people, you know, become more aware of what's on offer at their local doorstep, and increases confidence in people actually using green spaces, not just those local ones, but they may feel, you know, a bit more empowered to actually explore areas a bit more further afield. And, you know, that's something that people, it's just getting rid of that intimidation, which we've written down as a challenge, really. And again, funding is a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity if people, you know, if venues look at collaborating on joint funding bids, maybe for providing sort of in-kind support for an activity that community organisation may want to embark on, or a project. I mean, these community organisations regularly access funding from local council schemes, trusts and statutory bodies, and bids can always be strengthened if there is some sort of genuine and sustainable partnerships that can be demonstrated as part of a funding bid. And then, you know, that way the project will actually reflect the needs and aspirations for the local people, but will also benefit the venue as well. So I think sort of we've tried to race through some of the work that we're currently doing. Hopefully we've provided you with a little bit of insight into what we've been doing in West London in green spaces. So thank you so much for listening to us. And, you know, if you have any questions, we're more than happy to take them at this point.
Thank you, Mitra Neena. Thank you. Very quick question, if anyone has one.
Yes, I've got a question regarding increasing confidence in using green spaces. Rural gardeners is exactly where we feel most at home in these spaces. Beyond the safety issue, what were the problems that people said before they would have the confidence? What were they worried about?
I think a lot of, because some of the sites that we worked on with were heritage sites, and it's the confidence of actually in the first place going into those sites and there being a sort of free to access and everybody is welcome. It's that welcome, you know, thing. And if you've engaged in some sort of community activity, or if they've had a tour of the site, it's the confidence of going in there and actually using it for what is the intimidation. It's to break down those sort of barriers of perception a lot of the time. So even though, like you're saying, you know, it's actually using it rather than just say walking through a site. You know, I wouldn't actually say that it's not a challenge to walk through a site. If a lot of people may use a park or something as a cut through to somewhere, but actually using it to engage in some sort of activity. That is what we mean about increasing in confidence. I don't know, Rinku might want to add a bit to that.
I think also for some families, I think particularly in some formal gardens, I think they feel like, you know, if their children start running around or touching flowers or, you know, picking the odd leaf, I think, you know, things like that can sometimes be a bit of a, you know, barrier. So they'd rather just, you know, walk through the local park and go to the play area rather than actually explore nature, as it were. So I think there's a bit of a you know, hurdle to overcome there as well with some families who, and you know, these families are growing up in urban spaces, so you know, their local park sometimes is the only actually green space that they probably visit really regularly. So to be amongst, you know, sort of trees, woodland, where they might not know the you know, the direct way to get to the car park, or what routes that may be quite safe for them and their children. So it's sort of a bit of wayfinding sessions that we sometimes have as well for some of the families that come to the parks.
Great, thank you so much, Neena and Rinku. Really interesting. There's definitely some kind of common themes between the community gardens we spoke about today, especially things like access and intimidation of the space. And yeah, so this has all been really interesting to bring up. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you for joining us on Zoom.
Thank you, Leslie, so much. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got like 10 minutes. That's it. That's what we've got. 10 minutes. So we'll be back in here in 10 minutes. So just a very quick break. Lou or very